A warm welcome back. I'm Sage and you're watching Kalkine TV live from Sydney, and this is the Economic Corner Show, where we update you on all the biggest global economic announcements. First up on the Economic Corner today is the Wellbeing New Zealand Budget 2021. The country significantly lifted their welfare benefit rates and promised billions of dollars towards addressing long-term challenges in its 2021 budget, while forecasting a stronger than expected economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The budget for the 2021 fiscal year allocated funds towards housing, healthcare, education and infrastructure, while also targeting issues like child poverty, climate change and welfare of the indigenous Maori. The highlight, however, was a hike in the weekly benefit rates by up to $55 New Zealand per adult, which the government said was the largest income increase in a generation. The Treasury projected a budget deficit of $10.83 billion for the fiscal year ending June, narrower than the $21.576 billion New Zealand had forecasted in its half-year fiscal update in December. The deficit peaks at 5.3% of gross domestic product in June 2022 before declining to 0.6% of GDP by June 2025. Net debt was forecast to peak at 48% of GDP in 2023, compared to the 52.6% forecast made in December. New Zealand's GDP for 2021 was seen at 2.9% and gradually reaching 4.4% by 2023, thanks to a stunning economic rebound from the impacts of COVID-19. Unemployment is forecast to fall back to 4.2%, and an extra 200,000 people will enter employment over the next 4 years. Operating allowance for the budget is 3.8 billion New Zealand dollars per year, with capital allowances for budget 21 to 2024 increasing to 12 billion New Zealand dollars. Hit by the pandemic in 2020, the New Zealand government unleashed a record $50 billion New Zealand dollar fund in its budget last year, while the central bank released a massive $100 billion New Zealand dollar quantitative easing program and cut interest rates. While these generous monetary and fiscal support helped New Zealand's $200 billion in its fight against COVID-19. It also fueled a housing crisis and worsened inequality. Rising inequality is arguably the biggest political challenge facing Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's centre-left government in its second term in office. Moving on to some economic data announcements. Australia's jobless rate fell for a sixth consecutive month in April to the lowest in a year, despite a shocking drop in employment as fewer people went looking for work, sending the local dollar climbing. Thursday's figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or ABS, showed a decline of 30,600 jobs in April, confounding economists' expectations for a 15,000 increase. Unemployment eased to 5.5%, the lowest since April 2020, and marking a remarkable recovery from the top of 7.4% hit last July, when coronavirus lockdowns tipped the economy into recession. And while the better-than-forecast improvement will be welcomed by the country's central bank, there is still plenty spare capacity in Australia's labour market. The Reserve Bank of Australia, or RBA, believes full employment, the level where the labour market is tight enough to generate wage pressure, could be around 4% or lower. The participation rate declined to 66% to be back to around pre-pandemic levels. And meanwhile, Japan's exports grew the most since 2010 in April, supported by a favourable comparison with the sharp plunge seen during the coronavirus pandemic a year earlier, while capital spending also rose in an encouraging sign of a trade-led recovery. Supporting the outlook, Japanese manufacturers' confidence hit a more than 2-year high in May on the back of solid overseas demand. Improving exports stood in comparison with a year ago when a slump in global trade due to global coronavirus lockdowns dealt a heavy blow to the world's third largest economy. Exports rose 38% in April from a year earlier, compared with a 30.9% increase expected by economists and following a 16.1% rise in March. And that was the fastest gain since April 2010, led by US-bound shipments of cars and car parts and Chinese demand for chip-making equipment. And next up is the Canada CPI numbers. The Consumer Price Index rose 3.4% on a year-over-year basis in April, up from a 2.2% gain in March. A significant proportion of this increase was attributable to a steep decline in prices in April 2020, as the monthly CPI rose 0.5% in April 2021. On a seasonally adjusted monthly basis, the CPI rose 0.6% in April. Excluding energy, the CPI was up 1.6% year over year in April, following a 1.1% increase in March. In April 2020, the headline CPI fell 0.2% year over year, and the first CPI decline in over a decade. As a result of the broad decrease in prices in 2020, base year effects continued to have an upward impact on consumer inflation, contributing to the strong acceleration in April 2021. And year-over-year consumer price growth in April rose at its fastest pace since May 2011, amid the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, mostly because prices fell sharply during the early months of the pandemic. As some regions extended restrictions to limit the spread of COVID-19, causing employment losses for some Canadians, prices grew 0.5% month over month in April 2021, the same growth rate as in March 2021. Prices rose in every major component on a year-over-year basis. Transportation prices increased in April, mainly because of higher gasoline prices compared with April 2020. Moving on to inflation numbers in the euro area now. The euro area annual inflation rate came in at 1.6% in April 2021. This is up from 1.3% in March. And a year earlier, the rate was 0.3%. European Union annual inflation was 2.0% in April 2021, up from 1.7% in March. A year earlier, the rate was 0.7%. These figures are published by Eurostat, the statistical office of the European Union, and the lowest annual rates were registered in Greece, Portugal and Malta, while the highest annual rates were recorded in Hungary, Poland and Luxembourg. And compared with March, annual inflation fell in 3 member states, remained stable in 1 and rose in 23. In April, the highest contribution to the annual euro area inflation rate came from energy, followed by services, food, alcohol and tobacco, and non-energy industrial goods. Meanwhile, the latest house price data published on gov.uk by HM Land Registry for March 2021 shows that average house prices in the UK increased by 10.2% in the year to March 2021. This is up from 9.2% in the year to February 2021. Because of the impact of coronavirus pandemic on both the number and supply of housing transactions, there might be larger revisions to the published House Price Index estimates than usual. And London continues to be the region with the lowest annual growth for the 4th consecutive month. The pandemic may have caused house buyers to reassess their housing preferences. In the UK HPI data, the average price of detached properties increased by 11.7% in the year to March 2021, in comparison with flats and maisonettes increasing by 5.0% over the same period. The average UK house price was £256,000 in March 2021. This is £24,000 higher than in March 2020. Now, let us move on to other important news from the pandemic recovery phase. The European bloc's 27 countries provisionally agreed on Wednesday to open up to fully vaccinated visitors and ease rules that bar non-essential travel from countries where coronavirus infection rates pass a cut-off point, but member states would also have discretion to apply an emergency brake on visits from countries with variants of concern or interest, and the UK may fall into this category. The tentative EU agreement still needs formal ministerial approval and is in any case a recommendation only. And on the other hand, India reported more than 4,500 COVID-19 deaths on Tuesday, the highest known single-day tally of any country during the pandemic so far. And as more victims of a devastating second wave succumb to the disease, the latest deaths push India's official toll from the pandemic to more than 283,000, although public health experts say the true number of fatalities is undoubtedly several multiples higher, given the lack of testing in hard-hit rural areas. Lastly, here are some key takeaways from the Federal Open Market Committee meeting. And the minutes were as follows. According to the minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee's meeting in late April, officials generally said the US economy remained far from its twin goals of full employment and price stability and still required very loose monetary policy. But several argued that the time might come relatively soon this year for the Fed to change its stance. A number of participants suggested that if the economy continued to make rapid progress toward the committee's goals, it might be appropriate at some point in upcoming meetings to begin discussing a plan for adjusting the pace of asset purchases. The Fed under Chair Jay Powell is currently buying $120 billion of Treasury securities and agency mortgage-backed securities each month, and has vowed to continue at that pace until it sees substantial further progress and towards its inflation and employment targets. The Federal Reserve is committed to using its full range of tools to support the US economy in this challenging time, thereby promoting its maximum employment and price stability goals. The path of the economy will depend significantly on the course of the virus, including progress on vaccinations. The ongoing public health crisis continues to weigh on the economy, and risks to the economic outlook remain. Thanks so much for joining us on that report, and that is all from the Economic Corner for today. Being a data-heavy day, stay tuned for more of the latest news and market updates, and I shall be back shortly with the market close commentary and the last trade. This is Sage signing off.